The small village of Hazelwick-on-Hather, tucked comfortably between gentle hills and winter-bleached meadows, wore the soft hush of December like a woolen scarf. Smoke curled from chimneys, holly-adorned cottage doors, and a faint scent of cinnamon wafted from the bakery at the crossroads. At the heart of the village stood a crooked green, white with frost, where children skated precariously upon an ice-slicked pond while mothers fretted from the edges. In a modest cottage on Church Row, Mrs. Judith Maplewood, widow, amateur naturalist, and genteel observer of human behaviour, sat by her parlour window, polishing her spectacles. She was a soft-spoken lady in her late 60s, fond of knitted shawls and sensible shoes, and blessed with an indefinite expression that encouraged confidences. Her mind, however, was anything but indefinite. It was sharp, orderly, and quietly relentless. Judith sipped her morning tea and watched the village postman trudge past her gate. Mr. Edwin Cotter, a thin, wiry fellow, with a nose reddened permanently by cold weather and early hours, had delivered letters in Hazelwick-on-Hather for nearly 20 years. He prided himself on punctuality, and possessed a cheery whistle that could be heard long before he appeared on any lane. This morning, however, something was amiss. Edwin did not whistle. His gait was slower, and though he nodded politely at Judith's window, his eyes had a pinched, anxious quality. "Poor man looks exhausted," Judith murmured. As she set down her teacup, a sharp knock rattled her front door. She rose, opened it, and found the rather flustered figure of Mrs. Agatha Christie, a neighbour notorious for her energetic gossip and formidable baking. "Mrs. Maplewood, oh, you won't have heard. Yet terrible business," Mrs. Christie shrilled, breath puffing in the chilly air. Judith stepped aside and gestured her in. "Come in, Agatha. Compose yourself with a cup of tea." Mrs. Christie removed her hat in jerky motions and settled into a parlour chair. "It's about Edwin Cotter, the postman. They found him at the bottom of Blackthorn Hill. Stumbled off his bicycle, they think." A cold flutter touched Judith's stomach. "Is he harmed?" Mrs. Christie cast her eyes upward dramatically. "Dead as mutton." Judith closed her hands in her lap, absorbing this. "How dreadful! A simple accident?" "So they say," Mrs. Christie said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "But I heard Constable Turner muttering about odd marks on the ground, as if the bicycle had been pushed." Judith's brows lifted slightly. Mrs. Christie continued breathlessly. "And Edwin was delivering the Christmas Club envelopes today, the little savings packets people put aside all year. Cash, you know. He would have had a bag full of money on him." Judith felt a familiar tug in her mind, a tightening that always preceded serious thought. Was the money missing? "Apparently not," Mrs. Christie said with surprise. "Bag still full, untouched." That made matters more curious. A robbery gone wrong seemed unlikely if nothing had been stolen. Judith rose from her chair and fetched her shawl. "Where are you off to?" Mrs. Christie asked, startled. "To pay my respects at the Tous scene," Judith replied gently. "And perhaps offer help, if any is needed." Mrs. Christie watched her as though she were marching to war. "You do have a way of noticing things, Mrs. Maplewood. Just be careful." Judith smiled faintly. "Careful is precisely what I intend to be." Edwin Cotter's body had already been taken away by the time Judith reached Blackthorn Hill, but Constable Turner remained, studying the frost-covered ground. He was a stout, earnest man, recently transferred from a city post. Rural life had not yet softened his edges. "Good morning, Constable," Judith said softly. Turner straightened. "Mrs. Maplewood, I thought it best if villagers kept some distance." "My apologies," she said mildly, "but I knew Mr. Cotter well. A dependable man. It pains me to think of him lying here in the cold." Turner sighed, rubbing his gloved hands. Nasty spill, that's all. Road's icy. Of course. Yet I notice there are no scuff marks from correcting his balance, Judith observed calmly. Turner frowned. Beg pardon? She pointed delicately with the tip of her cane. When a cyclist slips, they instinctively drag a foot or twist the pack, handlebars. But the tire tracks are straight until she stepped closer, this sudden sideways skid, as though the bicycle were shoved. Turner's mouth opened slightly. He looked from the ground to her and back again. Well, I hadn't dismissed the possibility, he said defensively. Judith nodded. Who first found him? Dr. Pennington was driving past to see a patient. Ah, and Edwin had his delivery satchel with him? Yes, heavy thing too. All the Christmas Club envelopes. Turner exhaled. If someone meant to kill him, leaving the money untouched makes little sense. Judith murmured thoughtfully. Unless the motive had nothing to do with theft. The wind swept across the hill, then cold, sharp, almost whispering through the hedges. Judith drew her shawl tight. Constable Turner cleared his throat. Please leave this to me, Mrs. Maplewood. Official investigation and all that? Of course, Judith said, smiling serenely. She turned away, though her mind was already meticulously turning over possibilities. Edwin Cotter had known everyone's secrets, after all. A postman often did, and someone, it seemed, had not wanted him to reach. Christmas. The day after the accident, Hazelwick-on-Hather buzzed like a disturbed beehive. Conversations hushed when Judith passed, but doors opened to her readily. Villagers trusted her discretion and felt compelled to share their worries. She began, naturally, with those closest to Edwin, Cotter's daily rounds. 1. Mrs. Lillian Mortham, the manor house. The Mortham estate perched upon a rise overlooking the village, though its grandeur had faded somewhat with the years. Mrs. Lillian Mortham, once regal, now carried an air of exhaustion. Her daughter, Alice, hovered nearby, pretty and pale as milk. Terrible business, Mrs. Mortham murmured as she poured tea. Edwin was always polite, always punctual. Alice fidgeted with her teacup. He brought a registered letter yesterday morning. Mother signed for it. Judith asked gently, Do you recall the sender? Mrs. Mortham hesitated. A solicitor in London, Alice added quickly. About the mortgage. A strained silence fell. Judith let it rest for a moment before redirecting. Did you notice anything unusual about Mr. Cotter yesterday? Mrs. Mortham's eyes slid to her daughter. He seemed troubled, glanced over his shoulder more than once. Alice shivered. He told me someone had been following him on the lanes. Following him? Judith repeated. Alice nodded. He said he might just be imagining things, dark mornings and all, but he seemed sincerely unsettled. Judith tucked that knowledge away. Fear could make a man clumsy on icy roads, but fear also hinted at danger. 2. Mr. Harold Bexley, the butcher. Mr. Bexley was a broad-shouldered man with a booming laugh that rarely matched the glint in his eyes. Heard about Edwin, he said while sharpening a day. Cleaver, with rhythmic swipes. Shame, proper shame, Judith observed. You received your Christmas Club envelope yesterday, did you not? Indeed, Bexley grunted. Whole year's savings. Helps keep the shop afloat in slow months. Did Edwin seem nervous when he delivered it? Bexley paused, Cleaver, midway. Nervous? No, but distracted. Asked if I'd seen a green motor car pass earlier. I hadn't. Green? Judith echoed. Aye, dark green saloon. He said it had lingered behind him twice that morning. That made a pattern, someone following Edwin. Twice now it had been. Mentioned. Judith thanked him and moved on. Thoughtful. 3. Dr. Bernard Pennington, the village GP. Dr. Pennington's surgery was a cramped building smelling faintly of antiseptic and old books. The doctor himself was a fussy gentleman with spectacles perched precariously on his nose. "I found the poor fellow halfway down Blackthorn Hill," Pennington said, smoothing his moustache. "Still warm, but quite gone. Neck snapped. Instant, I'm afraid," Judith asked. "Did the bicycle appear damaged?" "Slight bend in the wheel, yes, as one would expect." "What of footprints? Anyone else present?" Pennington shook his head. "Just Edwin, the bicycle, and the satchel." "But I understand he seemed troubled lately," Judith said. Pennington hesitated. "He had come to me 2 weeks ago complaining of insomnia. Said he heard someone outside his cottage at night." "Did you investigate?" "Of course. Likely a fox or stray dog." Judith doubted that. Edwin had been a cautious man, unlikely to misinterpret an animal for a lurker. 4. Miss Daphne Holt, the post office clerk. The post office, warm and cluttered, was run by Miss Daphne Holt, a woman of brisk movements and sharp features softened by a fondness for floral scarves. She looked more pale than usual. "It's awful, Mrs. Maplewood. Edwin was a good man, honest as they come." Judith nodded sympathetically. "Was there anything unusual about his route yesterday? Any difficult deliveries?" Daphne bit her lip. "He asked for a revised route." "Revised?" Judith leaned slightly forward. "Yes. Said he wanted to avoid the old quarry path. Claimed it was icy. But that wasn't like him. He was a creature of strict habit." "Did he give a reason?" Daphne looked down. "Only that. He'd been receiving odd letters. Anonymous." Judith's heart quickened. "What sort of letters?" "I never read them, but he said they contained warnings. About staying silent. About knowing too much." A chill not from the winter passed through Judith. "Do you still have them?" she asked. Quietly, Daphne fetched a small bundle tied with string. "He left them here for safekeeping. Said he'd speak to Constable Turner after the holiday." Judith untied the string carefully. Inside were 3 notes typed on plain paper. "Keep away from what doesn't concern you. You were seen. One more word, and you won't finish your route." Judith exhaled slowly. This was no accident. Edwin Cotter had been murdered, and whoever had done it did not intend to stop at threats. The mystery began to stretch out before Mrs. Judith Maplewood, like an intricate piece of lace threads crossing in places unexpected, patterns half-formed and shimmering with possibility. Edwin Cotter, modest and mild-mannered, had clearly lived the final weeks of his life under a creeping shadow. Yet who had cast it? Judith found herself returning, as she often did, to her fireside in the evening, letting the soft glow of embers and the gentle tick of the mantel clock support the quiet concentration of her thoughts. A folded blanket warmed her knees, and a notebook lay open beside her teacup. On crisp pages she listed suspects and motives, though several felt tangled and uncertain. But one thought was entirely clear. Someone in Hazelwick-on-Hather had feared Edwin Cotter, and fear was a potent motive for murder. The next morning brought a brittle frost that glittered pleasantly across the Mortham estate. Judith had returned, this time not for tea, but to speak with Arthur Pym, the groom and groundsman. Stabled horses often saw more of a village's secrets than people realized, and so did those who tended them. Arthur, a stooped man in his 50s with wind-chapped cheeks, greeted her with a respectful tug at his cap. "Morning, Mrs. Maplewood." Good morning, Arthur," Judith replied. "May I trouble you a moment regarding Mr. Cotter?" Arthur's mouth tightened. A shame about that poor soul, indeed. "I understand he passed through the estate yesterday morning. Did you notice anything?" Arthur scratched his chin. "Saw him, pedalling up the drive. Looked behind him twice, which struck me as odd. He was being followed, perhaps?" "Could be. though the only car I saw yesterday was Miss Alice's. She was out early, said she needed to fetch something from the village." Judith glanced toward the house. Alice had seemed nervous the previous day, but she had not mentioned driving into the village. "Did her mother go with her?" Judith asked casually. "No, ma'am. Miss Alice drove alone. Came back looking rather flushed." Judith nodded, thanked Arthur, and tucked that fragment into her growing mental tapestry. It did not prove anything, merely whispered possibilities. 2. A green saloon motor car. The mention of Alice Mortham reminded Judith of something Mr. Bexley had said. The postman had noticed a dark green saloon tailing him. Only 3 such cars existed in Hazelwick-on-Hather. 1 belonged to the Morthams, 1 to Dr. Pennington, and 1 to a newcomer, Mr. Lionel Carver, a reclusive man renting one of the old railway cottages near the edge of the village. Judith wrapped her scarf tighter and made her way there next. The cottage sat crooked and neglected, its garden overrun. A motor car indeed stood outside a dark green saloon with muddy tires, mud that could easily have come from Blackthorn Hill. Judith approached the gate. Before she could lift the latch, the door opened abruptly. A lanky man in his 30s stood framed in the doorway, eyes wide and watchful. "Yes?" he asked sharply. Judith softened her tone. "Good morning, Mr. Carver, is it? I am Mrs. Maplewood. We haven't been formally introduced." He eyed her suspiciously. "I keep to myself." "So I've heard," she replied pleasantly. "I wondered if you might have seen Mr. Edwin Cotter on his rounds yesterday." "The postman? No, I don't receive much post." He crossed his arms. "Why?" "Just gathering information," she said lightly. "A simple curiosity." Carver shifted. "I was in Dorchester yesterday. Got receipts." He nodded at the saloon. Car never left its place. Again, Judith gave a gentle smile. "I see. And yet—" She stepped closer. "Those tires look quite freshly muddied. Hardly the dust of Dorchester's roads." Carver's jaw clenched. "I don't have to explain myself to you." "No, indeed," Judith said pleasantly. "But it is rare that one finds fresh mud after a dry frost." He slammed the door before she could finish. Judith waited a moment, listening to the tense silence settling over the cottage. It was not guilt she sensed behind that door, but fear, raw and trembling. Someone terrified of being drawn into a murder investigation, whether or not he deserved to be. 3. The Christmas Club mystery. Judith next visited Miss Daphne Holt at the post office. She felt certain that the truth lay somewhere among the Christmas Club envelopes. Small though they were, they represented a year's worth of careful village savings. Edwin Cotter had been responsible for their delivery, and someone had been watching him closely. "Daphne, may I see the list of recipients?" Judith asked gently. Daphne fetched a ledger. Neat columns recorded names and amounts. Judith noticed something immediately. 2 of the envelopes had not been collected from the post office. Their owners had asked Edwin to deliver them personally. Those names were 1. Mrs. Lillian Mortham, 2. Mr. Harold Bexley. Judith's thoughts quickened. Why would only these 2 insist on personal delivery? Did Edwin ever mention concerns about these envelopes? Judith asked softly. Daphne sighed. Only that he disliked carrying such amounts alone. But he trusted the villagers. Judith thanked her and departed, pausing just outside to take a deep breath of cold air. Trust, she mused, was the hinge upon which village life swung. When that hinge rusted, everything fell apart. 4. The butcher's quiet secret. That afternoon Judith returned to the butcher's shop. Mr. Bexley, red-faced and sweating from his work, greeted her without cheer. "Back again, Mrs. Maplewood? More questions?" "I'm afraid so," Judith said kindly. I wonder if you know that Mrs. Mortham also had her savings delivered yesterday. Wouldn't know, Bexley grumbled. No? Judith's voice held mild curiosity. It's just, you both insisted on Edwin delivering your envelopes personally. I wondered if he might have mentioned why. Bexley froze for a fraction of a second, just long enough to betray unease. It's my money, he snapped. I wanted it in my own hands. Of course, Judith said, but curious, is it not, that two villagers who scarcely speak share the same preference? His cleaver struck the chopping block harder than necessary. You're barking up the wrong tree. Judith drifted closer. Mr. Bexley, did Edwin ever confront you about anything? Silence thickened between them. Then Bexley muttered under his breath. He saw something he shouldn't have. That's all. Judith felt her heartbeat steady into a calm, expectant rhythm. Oh, and what might that be? Bexley's face hardened like granite. Private business. Mine. Not yours. She studied him a moment. His stance was defensive. Yes, but she detected something else behind the bluster. Shame. Not guilt. Not violence. Shame. She left him without pressing further. A butcher with a secret was not always a murderer with a motive. Still, Edwin, seeing something he shouldn't, was a thread she would return to. 5. A sudden turn. Evening had nearly fallen by the time Judith wrapped her shawl around herself and stepped onto Church Row again. Frost glittered along the hedges, lamplight glowed through cottage windows. She was nearly home when hurried footsteps approached. Constable Turner, Mrs. Maplewood, he called. There's been a development. Judith waited calmly. Yes? We found something lodged between the stones at Blackthorn Hill. A button from a coat. A small chill entered Judith's spine. A man's coat? Turner shook his head. No, a woman's. Dark green wool. Judith's eyes widened slightly. Dark green. She thought of Miss Alice Mortham's driving that morning. Her nervousness, her flushed return. A new thread had just woven itself into the tapestry, one that changed the shape of the entire design. The discovery of the small, dark green button at Blackthorn Hill weighed heavily on Mrs. Judith Maplewood. She sat by her fireside that evening, the soft glow of the lamp flickering against her spectacles. The button was ordinary enough round, plain, slightly worn, but in its simplicity lay its truth. Someone had been present at the scene, and it was no stranger to Edwin Cotter. Judith spread out her notes. The Christmas, club envelopes, the green saloon, the frightened postman, the threatening letters, and the odd behaviour of villagers. She considered each carefully, seeking the thread that would lead her to the murderer. Fear, she murmured to herself. Not greed, not revenge. Fear. She tapped the edge of her teacup. The person wanted to prevent Edwin from delivering his letters, but without taking the money. Interesting. 1. The final interviews. Judith began her next morning by returning to the Mortham estate. She requested to speak privately with Alice Mortham. Alice appeared uneasy but obliged. Judith seated herself calmly across from the young woman. Alice, I understand you drove into the village yesterday morning. Alone, yes? Alice nodded, biting her lip. I needed to collect something from the post office. And the green saloon? Judith continued gently. Did you follow Edwin Cotter? Alice's cheeks flushed. I didn't mean any harm. I wanted to see who had been leaving those letters for him. I overheard him talking about the anonymous notes. I thought perhaps it was my mother's business. Judith allowed a moment for this to settle. So you drove behind him on Blackthorn Hill? Alice's gaze fell. Yes, but I never intended for him to fall. I didn't push him. Judith smiled faintly. Of course not. And yet, the frost is treacherous. One small slip. Alice broke into tears. I only wanted to protect our family. I thought if Edwin knew about the mortgage letters, or what I'd seen at the post office, he might tell others. Judith's mind turned slowly, meticulously. The letters, the anonymous threats, the green saloon, and the erratic behaviour now formed a clearer picture. But someone else must have manipulated the accident to appear coincidental. Judith returned home to review her evidence once more. She arranged the names. Mrs. Lillian Mortham, the matriarch, secretive about her finances. Alice Mortham, her daughter, frightened, had followed Edwin. Mr. Harold Bexley, the butcher, ashamed of some private matter. Mr. Lionel Carver, reclusive, dark green saloon, secretive, nervous. Miss Daphne Holt, post office clerk, unwitting keeper of the threatening letters. Judith thought about Bexley's shame and Carver's fear. She reviewed Alice's statements. She had been following Edwin to see the letters, but not to harm him. Then she remembered what Bexley had muttered. He saw something he shouldn't have. Judith's mind clicked. What had Edwin seen? Not theft, not murder itself, but something else, something deeply private, yet enough to inspire fear. And then it hit her. The two people who had insisted on personal delivery of their Christmas Club envelopes were Mrs. Mortham and Bexley. Bexley had spoken of a secret Edwin might have witnessed, and the letters, the anonymous threats, had been typed on ordinary paper, but deliberately intimidating. Someone had orchestrated a scenario where Edwin would be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The pieces began to fit. Someone had manipulated Edwin's routine, sending him up Blackthorn Hill at the precise moment the frost and his preoccupation would create the perfect accident. 3. Confronting the culprit, Judith requested Constable Turner meet her at the village hall the following afternoon. The hall, still decorated faintly with holly for the impending Christmas fete, provided a neutral ground. She began with calm precision, explaining how Edwin Cotter had been observed, where he had been followed, and the likely series of events leading to the fatal accident. Then she turned her gaze to Mr. Lionel Carver, who had arrived reluctantly, fidgeting with his gloves. Mr. Carver, Judith said gently, you were anxious about being seen near Blackthorn Hill, were you not? Carver swallowed. I wanted to avoid attention. Yes, I wasn't involved. And yet, Judith continued, you noticed Mrs. Mortham's letters and wanted to prevent any exposure of the estate's private matters. Is that correct? Carver's eyes widened. I did not harm him. I only— Judith lifted a finger. I understand. And yet, someone else took advantage of this situation. Someone who feared Edwin Cotter discovering their secrets and sharing them. Her gaze shifted to Mrs. Lillian Mortham, who sat stiffly in the corner. Her composure betrayed the faintest tremor of anxiety. Mrs. Mortham, Judith said softly, you had letters regarding your mortgage delivered personally by Edwin. You knew he had been threatened with anonymous notes, and you feared exposure of some financial irregularity? Mrs. Mortham's hands tightened on her lap. It was only an oversight in the accounts, nothing more. Indeed, Judith said, but someone observed Edwin and capitalized on your anxiety. That person followed him, ensured the hill was slippery, and counted on the frost to do the rest. Would you like to explain who assisted you, or perhaps who acted in fear on your behalf? All eyes turned to Alice. The young woman's shoulders slumped. It was me, she whispered. I meant only to check on the letters. I didn't mean for him to fall. Judith nodded slowly. And yet, your presence behind him, combined with the slippery conditions, created the fatal accident. But the initial seeds of fear, the threats, and the deliberate timing, that was orchestrated by your mother. Mrs. Mortham lowered her eyes. I only wanted to prevent scandal. I didn't anticipate this." Judith's tone was gentle but firm. Fear and secrecy can have consequences far beyond what we imagine. Edwin Cotter was a kind man who sought no harm, yet others' anxieties led to his death. Constable Turner nodded gravely. "I understand. So, Mrs. Mortham, while your actions didn't physically push him, your manipulation and fear of exposure created the conditions that led to his accident. Is that correct?" Mrs. Mortham murmured a quiet admission. "Yes." 4. A lesson in human nature. Later, Judith walked home through the frost-brushed lanes. Her heart was heavy with sympathy, yet her mind had never been clearer. Secrets and fear, even when intended to protect, can become instruments of tragedy. She paused by the village green, watching children attempt a clumsy spin upon the ice. Their laughter rang out, careless and innocent. In some way, that laughter was a reminder that life moved forward, even after sorrow. Judith thought of Edwin Cotter, diligent and conscientious, whose last rounds had been interrupted by human error, misjudgment, and anxiety. She sipped her tea from a flask she had brought with her, thinking how odd it was that even tragedy could be traced back through the minutiae of ordinary life. In her heart, she felt gratitude for her gift, the quiet, patient observation that allowed truths to emerge when others only saw shadows, and she resolved, once again, to keep watch over Hazelwick-on-Hather with the same gentle vigilance that had guided her for decades. The morning after Judith's revelation dawned crisp and clear. Frost still clung to hedgerows, but sunlight glittered off the icy surfaces like scattered diamonds. Hazelwick-on-Hather had regained a semblance of normalcy, though the shadow of Edwin Cotter's passing lingered. Mrs. Maplewood, wrapped in her warmest shawl, strolled to the village square, where a modest crowd had gathered for a remembrance of the beloved postman. Children carried small wreaths of holly, while adults murmured condolences to his family. Judith lingered quietly, noting faces and gestures with her usual meticulous attention. Though grief had softened the villagers' expressions, a subtle tension remained, a reminder that while the immediate danger was resolved, the undercurrents of fear and secrecy had not vanished entirely. 1. Justice and understanding. Constable Turner approached Judith with a polite nod. "We've spoken to the coroner," he said. "The verdict: accidental death, with mitigating circumstances of gross negligence. Mrs. Mortham's role, though indirect, will be noted, but there's no criminal charge." Judith inclined her head thoughtfully. "It is always difficult," she said, "when human frailty intersects with circumstance. Fear is a powerful force, sometimes more lethal than malice." Turner nodded. "Your observations were invaluable, Mrs. Maplewood. You saw what most of us missed." "Thank you," she replied. "But let us also remember Mr. Cotter's care and integrity. It is in the quiet, conscientious lives that tragedy often leaves the deepest mark." 2. A village restores its routine. By midday, Hazelwick-on-Hather resumed its usual rhythms. The bakery smelled of warm gingerbread, the blacksmith's hammer rang through the air, and the church bells rang a soft chime, reminding villagers of the passage of time. Judith visited Miss Daphne Holt at the post office. Daphne, relieved, smiled warmly. "Mrs. Maplewood, it feels lighter somehow." "Yes," Judith agreed. "Truth, even when uncomfortable, allows the heart to breathe again." She examined the ledger of the Christmas Club envelopes. And here, life continues. Edwin's work was meticulous. Let us honor him by ensuring his efforts are not forgotten. They sorted the envelopes together, sharing gentle conversation and the occasional village gossip. Even in the midst of tragedy, life retained its cadence. 3. Reconciliation in the Mortham household. Judith also called upon the Mortham estate. Mrs. Lillian Mortham appeared more composed than she had in days, though a faint pallor remained. Alice, too, seemed relieved that the truth had surfaced and that blame had been tempered by understanding. "Mrs. Maplewood," Mrs. Mortham said softly, "I cannot thank you enough for your discretion. Without your guidance, I fear this ordeal could have broken more than it mended." Judith shook her head. "No, Mrs. Mortham. Human error, fear, and accident, these are not crimes. They are reminders. Let this Christmas, though marred, be a lesson in honesty and careful thought." Alice embraced her mother briefly. "I never meant it to happen. I only wanted to help." Judith's eyes twinkled with gentle amusement. "Yes, my dear, but sometimes even the best intentions require guidance." 4. The postman's memory. That evening, Judith lit a small candle at the base of the village postbox, the place where Edwin Cotter had started his final round. A few villagers joined her, laying wreaths or handwritten notes in remembrance. Children, too, placed tiny pine cones and sprigs of holly, symbolizing the ongoing cycle of life and the care that Edwin had given to his community. Even those who had feared exposure, the Morthams, Bexley, and others, came quietly to reflect, recognizing that transparency, not secrecy, was the true safeguard of harmony. Judith observed them all, noting how grief softened into understanding. She saw in their faces the simple, enduring lesson that kindness, diligence, and courage could endure even the most unforeseen accidents. 5. Reflections by the fireside. Back at her own cottage, Judith returned to her fireside. She sipped tea from her familiar cup and wrapped herself in her shawl, allowing the warmth of both flame and reflection to enfold her. Her mind wandered over the events of the past week. Edwin Cotter's dutiful commitment to his work, the anonymous letters, and the fear they sowed, the Green Saloon and Alice's anxious pursuit, Mrs. Mortham's misguided attempt to protect her family, Mr. Bexley's quiet shame, unconnected to malice, all intertwined, Judith murmured to herself. Not crime in the conventional sense, but a mosaic of human foibles and misjudgment. She smiled, faintly, recalling the children on the village green earlier, their laughter pure and unguarded. And yet, life moves forward, she reflected. Even after tragedy, the heart endures, the village endures, and Edwin's memory will linger as an example of service and care. 6. A Gentle Christmas. Dawn. By Christmas morning, Hazelwick-on-Hather gleamed under a fresh snowfall. The villagers gathered for church services and festive tea, exchanging greetings and small gifts. Judith observed quietly from her seat near the back, her knitting forgotten in her lap. The bells rang, the choir sang, and she felt a comforting symmetry that even after fear, deception, and loss, human warmth and community could heal. She thought of Edwin Cotter once more. "He did not reach this Christmas," she whispered, "but his legacy does. In honesty, in duty, and in the small acts of care we offer one another, he is here." Epilogue. Life in Hazelwick-on-Hather slowly returned to its gentle rhythm. The post office functioned without interruption. Villagers went about their routines with renewed awareness of the fragility of life. And Mrs. Judith Maplewood continued her quiet vigil, her sharp mind observing the small dramas of human existence with unerring clarity. Occasionally, she would smile knowingly at a passing child, or nod in recognition to a neighbor's whispered confession, remembering always that it is in ordinary acts, in the careful attention to detail, and in the gentle understanding of human nature, that one finds both truth and solace. The frost glistened on the hills, the village chimed with its simple bells, and somewhere, unseen but remembered, Edwin Cotter's presence lingered, wrapped in the warmth of gratitude and enduring memory. And so, in the quiet English village of Hazelwick-on-Hather, a Christmas that began with tragedy, concluded with understanding, reflection, and the steady beat of human kindness, proof that even the smallest lives leave the deepest impressions.